Welcome to the I-24 News National Security Podcast in partnership with INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies. I'm your host, Nicole Zedeck. Each week, we bring you in-depth discussions with expert analysts on some of the most pressing national security challenges facing Israel today. So, let's get started. Ever since the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, neighboring Turkey has ramped up its military operations in the north, setting its sights on the Kurdish forces and even a new defense pact with Damascus. And so far, it's largely paying off for Turkey, and Kurdish forces have been pushed into a vulnerable position. Ankara sees the Kurds as an existential threat. And while the Kurdish forces were once one of America's key allies in the fight against ISIS, their fate is now uncertain. So what does the changing landscape in Syria mean for the future of Damascus, U.S. influence in the region, and Israel's security? In today's episode, we discuss Turkey's latest moves in Syria and what it means for the Kurdish forces. Well, to give us some more insight, we're joined in studio by Dr. Gallia Lindenstrauss, senior researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies and Tel Aviv University, and a specialist in Turkish foreign policy. Dr. Gallia Lindenstrauss, thank you for being with us on the podcast again. Happy to have you back.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, it's interesting for us to note as we're sitting here, it's been 2 months since really the coup that led to the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. And this was a coup that was backed by Turkey. Turkey backed the HTS forces to overthrow the Syrian government. And so now, 2 months later, where do we stand as far as the players inside Syria right now?
Well, I think the dominant player is Turkey, as you mentioned. Turkey didn't expect, when it supported the rebels' offensive this winter, that this would lead to Assad's fall. I think even the rebels were not sure that this would happen. But once it happened, of course, this has a trickling effect that is strengthening Turkey very much in the arena. Turkey basically's gamble on the rebels was a very threat gamble. It was not a gamble that was an easy gamble, and it was but it paid off. For a long time, it seemed like it was a wrong policy. The public didn't like it. It resulted in refugees. It resulted in the Kurds strengthening. It resulted in terrorist attacks inside Turkey. So people thought Erdogan was wrong in supporting the rebels, but it paid off. It finally did pay off.
And what was the reason in the first place behind Erdogan supporting the rebels? What is the goal that they had in overthrowing the Syrian regime?
Well, I think there was a mistake of calculation. Pretty much half a year into the Syrian civil war, basically Turkey tries to convince Assad to do political reforms, but it doesn't work. As we know, Assad went against its people, and then they decide that probably he's going to fall quickly, and they decide to support all the rebels, from the secular ones to the jihadist ones, all the spectrum of the rebels. And again, for a long time, it's a failed policy. But now that it paid off, of course, the rebels and the HTS at al-Sharaa know who to thank. They know that Turkey was very important in their success in gaining control in Damascus.
And so now we're seeing more of this foothold not only in Damascus, which we'll talk about more about just the strengthening between the two governments, and even if it's more of a de facto government, but also actual territorially. There's Turkish forces, troops on the ground inside Syria right now in the north of the country.
Well, throughout the Syrian civil war, we had a few Turkish offensives inside Syria, and indeed there are Turkish forces and there are Turkish-held territories which are basically by a Turkish-backed militia. So this is not new that we have Turkish military presence inside Syria, but while in the past Turkey was mainly interested in what was happening in northern Syria, I think today it's interested in all what is happening inside Syria. It has big plans for Syria. It wants energy routes to go through Syria, transport routes, trade routes to go through Syria, and for that Syria has to gain the Sharaa regime has to gain control over all the country.
And that's a difficult aspect in itself when we talk about reshaping Syria and the current country where it all stands. But it seems like Turkey is trying to fill this power vacuum, because right now it is a grapple for power in the region. Iran and Russia had been the main external power forces when it comes to Syria. Now, is Turkey a big enough force to kind of combat that influence that both Iran and Russia had inside Syria?
We'll have to see if it really manages to kick Iran and Russia completely out. Of course, Iran and Russia, there was a big blow to their control inside Syria, and both are very disappointed because they gave a lot of support to Assad throughout the years. But I believe that Russia might want to retain its bases. Well, it wants to retain its bases in Syria, but the question is, will Turkey and al-Sharaa allow it? The problem is that if they take out their bases from Syria, they probably will do it in Libya, and that's also not in the interest of Turkey. So I'm not sure where this is going, whether Turkey would prefer them to be in Syria or in Libya. And with regard to Iran, again, it's a question of whether al-Sharaa will gain control over the country, or there will be a resumption of the civil war. Because if there will be resumption of violence, then Iran will take advantage of that.
And this also ties into the Kurdish forces that are in the north of the country. If al-Sharaa can gain territory and really a strong power and influence over the entire country, this completely contradicts what we're talking about, the Kurds that are in the north of the country that want to be autonomous in that region. Let's start with just who are the Kurds, just to give our listeners an example of the Kurdish people that we're talking about right now.
So the Kurds are basically in 4 countries in the Middle East. We're talking about Turkey, about Syria, about Iraq, and Iran. We don't know numbers because none of these countries really want to count the Kurdish minority, but we're talking about between 35 to 40 million people across the region. One of the biggest people that don't have a state. And in Syria, they were really a persecuted minority. Some of these people didn't even have citizenship in Syria. But somehow in the Syrian civil war, Assad understood that he has to defend the west of the country, which is where the power centers of Syria are. So he basically, there was an agreement in de facto between Assad and the Kurds that the Kurds would gain autonomy in practice in northeast Syria, and they would not fight Assad. And that was how things went, and basically there was an autonomous region in northeast Syria. Now we have to understand that the Kurds are not the only people who live in northeast Syria, so it wasn't only the Kurds. And at some point when ISIS rose to power, the international coalition against ISIS needed forces on the ground, and the Kurds were very important forces. And then we also have the formation of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is both Kurdish forces and Arab forces backed by the US. And these have been an ally of the US in the recent years.
Is that relationship still strong now that U.S. President Donald Trump is in power? Because as you mentioned, the Kurdish forces, they had been a really strong ally in fighting the threat of ISIS, but now Donald Trump doesn't want any influence into what's happening in Syria right now. That's what he continues to say in his messaging. What does that have to do then with the relationship between the current U.S. administration and the Kurdish forces?
So first, the West has a moral obligation to these people who fought ISIS and made them roll back the way they did. And also, they've been very useful in keeping ISIS under control. They have been guarding the prisons in which we have still ISIS people in. And if they have to fight against the Turks because the Turks will attack them, then they won't be able to guard the prisons. So there is an incentive for the U.S. to continue to support the Kurds. We know that there are U.S. forces in Syria. It's only 2,000 forces, but they have been very efficient in keeping stabilities in the areas where they were deployed. But if we go back to Trump's in 2019, he said he wants to pull out these forces. And he basically said, Syria, it's only a desert and death. It's nothing. There's nothing good coming out of Syria. So there is concern that this time around, again, he will want to pull out the troops. But I think there are many voices inside his administration who are saying this force is very useful and that the Kurds are still important as U.S. allies.
And even if they are important as U.S. allies, and we'll see exactly what does happen with those U.S. troops in Syria, as you mentioned, let's talk about the goals from the Kurdish perspective right now, because now we have more of a picture of who they are and what they have been fighting for, even who they have been helping, the United States. But what is their main goal? What are they trying to do right now when it comes to both Syria and Turkey?
Well, in Syria, they want to maintain their autonomy. But the Syrian regime wants to have a centralized regime and wants to gain control over these territories. Now, basically, the Syrian regime is telling the Kurds, give up your arms and be integrated into the Syrian army. The Kurds are saying, we are willing to be integrated, but as a group. We are not willing to be integrated as individuals. We want to maintain our group identity. And I think it's a big dilemma. If you give up your arms, you give up also your chance for political control. You have to really trust the other side to do so. And I'm not sure that Kurds can trust al-Sharaa. I think beyond the ethnic divisions inside Syria, there's also the religious element. Basically, in the autonomous areas of the Kurdish-ruled autonomous areas, there was gender equality. We know that al-Sharaa, he has jihadist background, maybe he has moderated somewhat, but we know it's going to be a religious regime. We're not sure there's going to be religious freedom in the new Syria. And that's a big concern for the Kurds, which is understandable.
And what about the Kurds in Turkey? I know you mentioned that it's difficult to gain an actual understanding of how many of the different Kurdish population there is, but in Turkey it is estimated anywhere between 10 to 15 million, 18% roughly of the entire country's population. This is a large ethnic minority, and so the Kurds that are in Turkey, what do they think about Erdogan's moves right now when it comes to just over the country in Syria?
Well, of course, if we talk about Turkey and the Kurds, we talk about also the Kurdish underground, the PKK, and the PKK has been fighting Turkey since 1984. And actually, inside Syria, we have the Syrian branch of the PKK, which is dominant. So we can understand from Turkish perspective, this is a terror problem. You talked about it as an existential threat, but I think mostly it's also a terror threat that is a big problem for Turkey. Now, Turkey, how to deal with the Kurdish minority has been an overriding question in Turkish history and a big problem socially. Some of these people are integrated, but some people are not happy with the Turkish government and the fact that, for example, you can't learn Kurdish in schools, not only in public schools, but you can't even learn Kurdish in private schools. So that's a big issue, the identity issue. We have, interestingly, while in Syria, Turkey is being non-compromising and very clear in its demand that the Kurdish forces will give up their arms. Inside Turkey, we now have a process of political dialogue with the PKK head, the PKK leader, which is in a prison. There is a dialogue, and he's supposed actually to give a speech this week, maybe giving up a historical speech, maybe saying that he has decided that no longer to go in the violent route and give up the arms.
And why would that be?
Well, he's been in prison since 1999. We know he has gone through a process of transition in the prison. He no longer speaks of a Kurdish state. He speaks about a democratic Turkey that gives
all rights to all people.
The possibility, yes, for the Kurds. And we don't know if the other people, the leaders of the PKK that are finding refugees in northern Iraq, will follow him. I mean, we know he's very charismatic and he's the leader of the group, and of course he's very important. And this historical speech, it's very interesting. I mean, to have a dialogue with the Kurdish population inside Turkey, but on the other hand, being very oppressive towards the Kurds in Syria. We don't know how it works out, and it seems the Kurds are saying it's probably not sincere if they're doing both things simultaneously, because we would expect that in both arenas they would be more open for dialogue.
More on the same page, it seems. Yeah. There's different messaging coming out here of these different leaders. Meanwhile, what about Israel? How does Israel play in? And is the relationship between both Israelis, or the Israeli government, or the Israeli forces, and the Kurdish forces?
Traditionally, Israel had relations with the Kurds of northern Iraq, with the Barzani family, which was the Kurdish Democratic Party. That was traditional Israeli relations. And we have to understand the Kurds are a big people. They have divisions inside them. So the KDP and the PKK don't cooperate that well. And so Israel basically chose historically with which Kurds to cooperate. There has been perhaps some change. Israel's foreign minister is very much pro-Kurdish, and he has been speaking with the Kurds of northern Syria. And I think what is very clear to be, and I think the Israeli government is also voicing this, is that Israel supports that the US forces will remain in northeast Syria. I think that is an interest of the US, of course, foremost against ISIS, but it's also an interest of Israel that these forces will remain in northeast Syria. Again, it's only 2,000 US forces there, but they have a symbolic value. They have a deterring effect against possible Turkish offensive against the Kurds, and I think that is a very vital interest also of Israel.
A possible Turkish offensive against the Kurds, how much of a reality is that? Because so far we have seen just some of these smaller operations, some of these smaller troops on the ground and clashes truly between these two groups, but a full-on offensive, is that something that could become a reality?
Yes, we thought it would already happen in a way around Christmas, also the transition between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. There was an opportunity for Turkey to act, and it didn't act. It's acting only sporadically, as you were saying. There might be a few reasons for that. First of all, I think for al-Sharaa, the Syrian new president, it's not a priority. He first wants to regain control in other areas, reestablish the Syrian army. I think this is not the first fight he wants to do. I think Turkey is also opening the possibility for diplomacy. We do see US pressures on the Kurds in northeast Syria. We see pressures from the Iraqi Kurds on the Syrian Kurds. So maybe they're still giving time for diplomacy. And lastly, as we spoke before, there's this attempt to have a diplomatic opening inside Turkey with regard to al-Julani. Erdogan needs this, by the way, because he wants Kurdish support to change the Turkish constitution. He wants to run for a third term. Currently, he can't run for a third term because you only have 2 terms of presidency in Turkey. So he wants the Kurds as a coalition partner, or not a coalition partner, but at least to enable these constitutional changes. So he wants this opening with the Kurds inside Turkey. And again, it's problematic to do this opening while doing an offensive in northeast
So it's
Syria.
more of the diplomatic route. It seems more like the viable option right now. You talk about diplomacy. That's something we also saw just recently. Ahmed al-Sharaa met with Erdogan in Ankara to discuss more of this, not only diplomacy between the two countries, but security, a defense pact possibly to come soon. And so what is the then building of the relationship and the significance between a meeting like that with al-Sharaa going to Ankara and in this public visit between the two leaders?
Well, clearly it means a lot that he goes to Ankara. We would even expect this would be his first visit abroad, but he went to Saudi Arabia. There was a bit of anticlimax in the sense that there was a talk that they would sign a defense pact between them. Of course, I'm sure they discussed it in their 3-hour meetings, but it wasn't signed at the end of the day. So it was a bit of an anticlimax. But as I said, Turkey is now interested in being in all Syria. It has no problem in having bases in northern Iraq. It had outposts in Syria. I'm sure they would want to build also bases inside Syria. I think Syrian army will need training. It will need equipment because Israel bombed a lot of the equipment, existing equipment, because they were afraid that it will fall in the wrong hands. So they need equipment. Turkey has very now sophisticated defense industries that it can supply Syria with its needs. So looking forward, I do see Turkey very much involved in the defense of Syria. But I would say that meanwhile, the fact that this has not happened yet does mean that things are not completely harmonious between Turkey and Syria.
There's more happening behind these closed doors. You talk about these military bases, perhaps, that Turkey does want to see inside Syria. What do some other countries in the region think about that? Could that cause some instability, perhaps, by having more of this Turkish presence inside Syria?
Well, of course, people want to understand in the region what Turkey wants. What's its end game?
What is the goal?
Okay, with regard to Syria, I think the state that has the most problem with it is actually Israel. Because during the Syrian civil war, basically Turkey was interested in the north, we were interested in the south. There wasn't much disagreement. But here, as I said, Turkey is looking at Syria as a whole. And that does cause Israel concern that its freedom of action to continue what it calls the campaign between war, or the war between wars, will be less than in the past. Because basically in the last years of Assad, Israel operated when it wanted it operated. So Israel is, of course, viewing these things with concern. But also the countries that view political Islam as a domestic threat see what Turkey is doing inside Syria as perhaps something that will encourage rebellious tendencies inside their country. So I think basically we look at the moderate Gulf states, they are viewing what Turkey does with concern. But currently, actually, we do see cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Turkey. UAE, Turkey is a different story. Egypt, Turkey is a different story. But again, the problem is that people don't completely understand what Turkey wants after Syria. Because Syria is one thing, but what do you want next?
This is just possibly step one in gaining more of this global influence by having more of this influence inside Syria. And that does beg the question, if we're talking about filling this power vacuum that Iran has left behind by losing its different proxies in the region, by losing Hezbollah, losing Hamas, losing the Assad regime, if Turkey is to come in and fill this power vacuum that Iran has possibly left behind in Syria, what does that mean for Israel? Because Erdogan is not the biggest ally to Israel at this time.
Yes, it's a source of concern. We do see a beginning of communication between Israel and Turkey about Syria, which is good news because we don't want to see Israel hurting Turkish forces by mistake while operating in Syria, and we don't want to see Turkey endangering Israel's security interests. For Israel, of course, it's very important that there will not be resumption of shipments to Hezbollah through Syrian territories. That is a very big concern of Israel, and I think if there could be guarantees that this is not happening, this would relax the tension. And Syria in itself is a problem. But when you add to Syria what is happening in Gaza and Turkey's position in Gaza, which is not only pro-Palestinian but very much pro-Hamas,
yes,
and they want to maintain Hamas, that Hamas will have presence in Gaza, political control in Gaza in the day after the war, then we see that there's a big problem between Israel and Turkey. But in the past, actually Syria was where these two countries connected. In the 1990s, basically, Turkey used its good relations with Israel to pressure Assad, the father, to expel the Kurdish underground forces that were on its territories. So I think the fact that you have this Syria that is a neighboring country for both states, and at the end of the day, I think both states do want stability there. Turkey for sure, and even for Israel, that some people questioned, I think Israel does want a stable Syria, a Syria that doesn't harbor terrorists, a Syria that is not a threat to Israel. And there is room for this scenario to happen in the sense that Syria needs a lot of money for reconstruction, and the West can supply this money for reconstruction. Saudi Arabia can help, UAE can help, and with this money, there will be conditions, and one of the conditions should be that Syria will not be a hostile state to Israel.
That should certainly be one of the conditions. And where do the Kurds then play into all of this big picture? What is your prediction then, Gallia, for where the Kurdish people stand in the next 1, 2, 5, 10 years?
Well, if there would be Kurdish statehood, I believe it would be in Iraq. But even in northern Iraq, we saw a lot of hurdles to independence when they did a referendum in 2017. In the independence referendum, this was basically blocked by all the other countries surrounding northern Iraq. So I'm not that optimistic about statehood for the Kurds. And the Syrian Kurds themselves, I think it's not only in the matter of statehood or autonomy, there is a danger here. And but the allies of the Kurds, and here especially the US, should make sure that they are not targeted by Turkey.
Dr. Gallia Lindenstrauss, we've been going very big picture here as we just have a few more minutes left of our discussion. I'm going to do a quick rapid fire round. I'm going to ask some questions and you just give the first thoughts and answers that come to your mind. And you're already leading me into this first one, when it comes to the United States, and we're talking about the Kurds in Syria, should the United States have more of a presence inside Syria?
It should keep its presence.
Maintain the status quo.
Maintain the status quo.
With everything that's happening, can Kurdish autonomy survive in Syria?
Very difficult. Very difficult, because the colliding interests here. The Bashar wants centralized control. The autonomy is a different issue.
How does a Turkey-Syria defense pact then change the balance of power in the region?
It doesn't change it that significantly, but it's a problem.
A problem that some of these other outside countries should at least be keeping an eye on and monitoring.
Yes.
The main goal right now when it comes to Turkey in Syria, if you had to pinpoint it to one goal, what would that be?
To make Syria a country that does respect ethnic rights, minority rights, religious rights, and is basically not hostile to the West. I'm not saying they're going to be pro-Western, but at least not hostile.
And do you think that Turkey has the influence to make that happen?
It doesn't have the influence. The question is, does it has the interest to do this?
Right now, as it stands, which is more dangerous to Israel, Turkey or Iran in Syria?
Iran. Iran wants to wipe Israel off the map. Turkey is very hostile to Israel, but has not yet voiced that.
And so if Turkey does have more of an influence and more of a power inside Syria, is there a possibility for more increased positive relations between Israel and Syria via Turkey?
It will be a counterintuitive result, but there is slight possibility that it will happen.
Dr. Gallia Lindenstrauss, your final message then as far as when it comes to your hope or possible outcomes when we talk about the Kurdish forces specifically combating the threat from Turkey.
The Kurds have shown their resilience. They're strong people. I think they're also clever people. They have to work up the inner divisions. That's their main problem.
It seems we'll have to be following how that does unfold when it comes to the ever-changing instability in the entire region, specifically in Syria as well. Dr. Gallia Lindenstrauss, thank you for giving us your insight and analysis into the Kurdish dilemma on this week's episode of the podcast. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, if you want to catch up on any of our past episodes of the National Security Podcast, you can always head to Spotify, just search National Security Podcast, and you can listen to all of our past episodes right there, all of our expert analysts and discussion on the most pressing national security challenges facing Israel today. As always, I'm Nicole Zedeck, and thank you so much for listening.